Controversy surrounding the potential deportation of Mahmoud Khalil has caused a great firestorm across the political conversation, and it has most people focused on the question, rather, of Israel and Palestine, or the question of Palestinian rights. But the true significance of this debate actually has very little to do about any foreign policy dispute, and more to do on the nature of citizenship and how a civilization should handle non-residents and foreigners who seek to inhabit their civilization, but do so harboring ideas that are contrary to it. So in this video, we're actually going to explore Mahmoud Khalil and the case of the non-citizen within that particular context. I'm going to go over the controversy. I'm going to provide a rigorous justification for as to why I believe that his deportation is not only just, it is necessary from a moral and a civilizational standpoint. But before we get into that, my friends, hope all of you are doing well. I'm Christian Watson. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary from a philosophical bent, then I must implore you to please like, share, comment, subscribe, donate if you wish. Every little bit helps. I appreciate all of you for being here. Again, this is a channel where we want to think deeper than the average bear, we want to think deeper than the average analyst. We want to actually explore the significance of issues in a manner that edifies us, not just for the day, but for the future as well, for posterity. So if that sounds like something that you want to do, then please, again, like, share, comment, subscribe. Thank you so much. Now, please enjoy the video. So, Mahmoud Khalil. He is a legal resident of the United States, who many of you probably heard of, who was also a student at Columbia, who is being basically targeted for deportation by the Trump administration for, in their words, supporting anti-American activities, particularly those that involve the support of Hamas. Now, Khalil actually was one of the big student leaders at the Columbia University protest that happened last year, which involved, amongst many other things, the seizure of a building called Hamilton Hall on the Columbia campus. It involved illegal student encampments being parked in the middle of the campus, which were used to intimidate and harass different students. It involved Khalil, who actually acted as a negotiator for those illegal encampments, basically blackmailing the university by demanding certain things that he and his friends had no right at all to demand. And if he had not got his demands, they will continue their occupation, so on and so forth. So from a very basic standpoint, not even considering his status as a legal resident, not a full citizen, it appears to me that he has bad character, and he views himself first as an activist and second as a guest in a particular country or a countryman. And that alone should tell you the kind of individual you're dealing with here. But then it gets even more interesting. So now that he is locked up being processed for potential deportation, the entire progressive media and legal establishment has mobilized to his side, and they're attempting to make this into a civil rights case. In fact, Mahmoud Khalil's lawyer himself said that the only reason that he's being charged for deportation is because, and I quote, they're trying to make, they being the Trump administration, they're trying to make an example of him to chill others from making similar speech. Not agreeing with your government's foreign policy decision to support Israel is not a reason for you to be in deportation proceedings. But this is actually the core question, isn't it? Is this really Mahmoud Khalil's government? In fact, does he have any stake or claim within our country at all beyond his legal status? And does his legal status confer him the right to go against the country he actually exists in? These are all quite important questions. And so this actually colors the content of my analysis in this video, which is going to focus on instead the nature of citizenship and the role of the non-citizen within that particular societal context. But before we get into that, Mahmoud Khalil's claim, now that he is in prison, he wrote a kind of prison letter, kind of similar to MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail, kind of similar in terms of the style and the genre, not at all in terms of substance, where he basically said, and I'll actually quote from the letter, that he believes that, quote, I have always believed that it is my duty not only to liberate myself from the oppressor, but also to liberate my oppressors from their hatred and from their fear. My unjust detention is indicative of the anti-Palestinian racism that both Biden and Trump administrations have demonstrated over the past 16 months, as the U.S. continued to supply Israel weapons to kill Palestinians and prevented international intervention. But once again, This shows that he views himself first as an activist, and second, he views the country he's in not necessarily even as a full country that has its own merits and considerations, but as an oppressive force which colors how he behaves within the country, which is also quite important. But most importantly, he also views this as primarily a foreign policy matter. But as I argued, this has very little to do with foreign policy in the grand scheme of things, and more to do with how countries and civilizations protect the character of their societies. So in order to analyze that, we have to first ask ourselves the question, we must go back to first principles. What is the basis for citizenship? Well, the basis for citizenship, my friends, is to be a member in a society. And if we actually trace the notion of society back through the history of ideas, we'll come upon this term called civitas. This is sort of the etymological root of civilization, civitas, a sort of Latin word. And civitas actually meant several different things. In Latin, it literally just means city. But it began to mean several different things. In Roman history, civitas meant a social body of citizens united by law. And it also meant that it was a city and a territory. But it also meant a community. So civitas is basically entails a community that is united by a core principle. This definition lines up perfectly with what Cicero, who was a great thinker and also greatly inspired the American founder's conception of what a country and civilization is, said in his wonderful work, A Treatise on the Commonwealth, about the nature of a commonwealth. Cicero said, now this is basically a dialogue, and one of the characters from the dialogue, called Scipio, said the following, said, quote, a commonwealth is a constitution of the entire people. The people, however, is not every association of men, however congregated, but the association of the entire number bound together by the compact of justice and the communication of utility. The first cause of this association is not so much the weakness of man as the spirit of association which naturally belongs to him. For the human race is not a race of isolated individuals wandering and solitary, but it is so constituted for sociality that even in the affluence of all things and without the need of reciprocal assistance, it spontaneously seeks society. So the Commonwealth is not just a gathering of people. The Commonwealth, on a much more fundamental level, is the fulfillment of man's inherent social nature. It is the fulfillment of what he needs to flourish. It is the fulfillment of what he needs not only to survive, but to thrive. It is the fulfillment and the basis of every sound structure of governments. And this is, by the way, what Cicero would go on to argue. He would go on to argue in this dialogue that a mixed government, something like a republic, is much preferable to a monarchy or a dictatorship or a democracy, but that mixed government is based upon this idea of the Commonwealth. So, if the Commonwealth is a collection of people bound together by law and utility, the question has to be, what are those bonds that people have insinuated by? What are the bonds that people have together insinuated by? Well, it's not just justice. Because justice is all well and good, but justice must have a social context on which to operate. It must have a backdrop, right? You can't just go to a tribe full of people that have never known a sense of law and say, be just. People must have an understanding of what it is to be just. They must be taught virtue. And so the social virtues, and particularly the social virtues in concert with the history of a particular people, are what define them and what allow them to be tied together much more than simply having an idea that has no groundings. That's why, for example, America is such a unique civilization. Because even though people can come from so many different walks of life and so many different areas of the world, they're tied together by these first principles. But these first principles have a backdrop, have a context rooted within this sort of self-discovery, rooted within this notion of consent of the government, rooted within these sort of Republican-type notions of what it means to have a good society. And these all define the character of the American people. So in order for a non-citizen, in order for a foreigner to come into our society, into our commonwealth, so to speak, he must have, or she must have, some appreciation of the social virtues. A non-citizen's inhabitants in this country is tied solely to the virtue of gratitude and also the virtue of respect. Now, Let me explain a little bit more what I mean. And I have to do this by going through how these two things relate to the Constitution of the Commonwealth. You can understand the Commonwealth and understand more so the term of citizenship by understanding citizenship as derivative of general truths and axioms, right? Many folks believe that citizenship is merely a legal designation. It is not. At least not in America. Perhaps it is in other places, but not in America. Citizenship is simply an agreement that you have to respect the country you're in, but it's more than that. It is a tie to the very essence of that country. So that means what citizenship means in your particular country, far from its general term, i.e. being a tie to a country, is going to differ depending on which country you're in. But in America, your citizenship is predicated upon you accepting a certain set of axioms, a certain set of truths about the nature of government, the nature of society, and about human beings, which is why when we talk about Americans and Americanism, it is defined by what it is for rather than what it is against. It is defined by a love of the Constitution. It is defined by a certain rationalistic view of man. It is defined by a certain respect for certain voluntary relationships. It is defined by a kind of independence. It is defined by a kind of moral equality, which are uniquely constituted in our country. And so the social virtues that we have tie into that insofar as foreigners must respect, and not just respect, but be gracious towards us in light of those social virtues. So if a commonwealth is in membership in a commonwealth is tied to citizenship, and citizenship is tied to general truths and axioms, then the foreigner standing within a country has to also be bound by those general truths and axioms, because if the citizens of the country are bound by them, then of course the foreigners who come must also be bound by them as well. This is different than being bound by our laws. Yes, foreigners and citizens are bound by laws, but first principles sometimes are reflected within the laws, but also are sometimes not reflected within the laws. So within Khalil's example, he clearly violates the principle of gratitude by claiming that America is an oppressor state and that he has to liberate it from itself. This is kind of deconstructionist, destructive idea and antagonistic position towards America is completely against gratitude. He also defies the virtue of respect because he does not respect America for what it is. He does not even respect the institution he was educated within. He simply sees it as a means to an end to make his case about Palestinian oppression. And so we have to also understand, though, because there are people that are saying that Khalil is justified in what he's saying and what he's doing by the First Amendment. And this is so because he has the natural right of free expression, which is being impeded upon by him being detained. Now, this is actually quite more interesting than the legal question. Because the legal question itself, you can just look at case law and you can say, okay, this is legal. But the moral question, requires a little bit more intuition, a little bit more rationalization than the legal question. So we have to understand that it is true. Mahmoud Khalil, like every person, every non-citizen, every citizen, has natural rights inherent to his being. However, general rights, you having a right generally, is not going to always tell you how those rights manifest in particular contexts, and it's not going to govern how those rights manifest in particular contexts. So for example, I have the natural right to move freely amongst places. But if I were to go to somebody's house and I were to demand they let me in, and I were to disrespect them in their own house and they throw me out, well, only someone who is morally illiterate would say that my natural right of moving freely is obstructed because I can no longer go in their house and disrespect them. No, because their house is governed by their rules and their natural right of ownership outranks your natural right of being able to move freely. Similarly, a nation and a commonwealth's natural right of self-preservation, which must be the case if any society or nation is to exist and sustain itself morally against opposing forces, outranks your ability, especially as a non-resident alien, as a legal status alien, to come into the country and spew things that go against social virtues, go against the general truths and axioms, and most importantly, go against the basic respect for the country you're in. So no, this is not merely a matter of natural rights. This is a matter of our right of self-preservation outranking his right of advocating a toxic idea that is essentially going towards the destruction of American civilization. And it's, by the way, it's actually quite clear that Mahmoud Khalil's group has called for the destruction of Western civilization. And in fact, I did a video on the Marxist nature of so many of these student protest groups. They don't necessarily hate Israel because they're anti-Semites. They hate Israel and they hate America because they view Israel and America both as proxies for capitalism, and their mission is to destroy capitalism because they believe capitalism is the paragon of sin within the world that must be eradicated. Mahmoud Khalil, when he talks about Palestinian liberation, he's really talking about something much more sinister that he's using the Palestinians as a proxy for. We have to understand this if we're going to actually contend with these people. So, for that reason alone, my friends, we have to understand that the non-citizen, not only is he not endowed with the same rights and privileges as the citizen, but he also, his standing in the society is much more slim and much more narrow and much more fragile than the citizen's standing, which is why he is tied to those social virtues that I particularly mentioned. Citizenship requires pre-political connections that go beyond the mere legal status of you merely being a citizen by birth or a citizen with your birth certificate. That is why the non-citizen's involvement in the country has to be of a certain special status, because they lack any of those pre-political connections and they have to be either integrated into them, but in order for them to be integrated with them, they must first respect them and be gracious towards the country they're in. If they can't satisfy those two things, then the pre-political connections of citizenship and of the Commonwealth more so would necessitate that they don't have any involvement on that basis alone. In closing, my friends, we have to understand that just because we are a nation that is very gracious, just because we are a nation that prides ourselves on being able to integrate people from all around the world into our American ethos, just because we are a nation that is kind, does not mean we are a nation that disregards our own self-preservation, does not mean we are a nation that has to accept hatred from foreigners on our own soil, and it most certainly does not mean we are a nation that has to have a botched understanding of morality, which permits its own destruction, rather than having a much more prudent and sound understanding of morality, which ties it to the preservation of society. You cannot invoke a moral right when your very behavior goes against the existence of a society, because without society, morality is not applicable, because you cannot steal someone's stuff, you cannot violate a promise if you live isolated on an island. So similarly, Mahmoud Khalil cannot claim some kind of moral wrong here, because the context is one in which our right to preserve ourselves outranks his supposed right, rather his privilege, to be here. And so the non-citizen must be treated not with suspicion, but he must be treated with a very particular set of premises, or else the non-citizen will be convinced that he can walk all over his host country however he wishes, and he can simply use them as an incubator for ideas that may oppose their ethos. We're Americans. My hope is we will not accept that standard for ourselves. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can to ensure our message gets out there. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.